$376,220. That's the number a forensic accountant read into the record during a Texas Workforce Commission fraud hearing on a January morning in a conference room in Plano, while my father sat across the table in a golf polo, arms crossed, looking at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. He'd been looking at me that way my entire life. I just didn't understand until I was 38 years old that it wasn't a personality trait, it was a strategy. For 22 years, I was the bookkeeper, the office manager, and, though nobody ever put it on a business card, the scapegoat of Bennett Craft Builders, my father's custom home construction company outside Dallas. Every family has roles. If you've ever read anything about narcissistic family systems, there's the golden child, the one who can do no wrong, there's the enabler, usually a spouse who smooths everything over, and there's the scapegoat, the one everyone quietly agrees is the reason things go wrong, even when the numbers say otherwise. I was the numbers person, and for 22 years I was also the reason, according to my father, that Bennett Craft Builders never quite made the money it should have. I believed him. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I explain this to people. I believed him for over 2 decades because he was my father, because my older brother Chris got the title and the truck and the client dinners, while I got the QuickBooks login and the blame, and because somewhere along the way I'd stopped asking why the math never seemed to add up the way it should have if the problem really was me. Then, in the spring of 2021, I resigned. I didn't resign to make a point. I resigned because I was exhausted, because I'd finally started therapy, because a counselor named Dr. Patel asked me one question I couldn't answer. If you're the reason the company struggles, why does it struggle worse every year you work harder? And I didn't have a comeback for the first time in my adult life. I thought I resigned would just mean I stopped showing up. I had no idea it would mean uncovering $376,000 my own father had taken from me, using my name, my social security number, and my signature, while telling everyone, including me, that I was the problem. They thought I'd just quietly walk away, the way scapegoats are supposed to. They were wrong. Before I get into it, I want to be clear about what kind of story this is, because it isn't a stranger danger scam story, and it isn't a simple embezzlement story either. It's both, tangled up inside a family dynamic that took me most of my adult life to even have language for. Today's story is about greed, about a family that assigned roles the way a director casts a play, and about what it actually takes financially, legally, and psychologically to get every single dollar back once you understand that you're too sensitive and you're bad with money were never honest assessments. They were cover stories. I'm going to walk you through exactly how my father built and maintained a role for me that made financial exploitation not just possible, but self-sustaining. Because as long as I believed I was the problem, I never looked hard enough at him. I'll show you the loan documents, the forged signatures, the payroll tax records, and the family text threads that eventually became evidence in a criminal referral. If you've ever wondered how financial fraud hides inside ordinary-sounding family dysfunction, that's just how that is. You know how he gets about money. Stay with me, because I'm also going to give you the exact warning signs I missed, the ones that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with roles. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe people who exploit their own children financially should face real consequences, hit subscribe now, because this channel is dedicated to exactly that: real financial fraud, real investigations, and real justice. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with a role I was handed before I was old enough to understand I'd been cast in it. My name is Rachel Doyle. I was born Rachel Bennett in Plano, Texas in 1983, the second of 3 children. My father, Gerald Bennett, founded Bennett Craft Builders in 1988, a custom home construction company that by the time I was in high school had a reputation across North Dallas for high-end spec homes and near impossible client demands that Gerald somehow always managed to charm his way through. My mother Diane worked the front desk in the early years, and once the company grew past that, became what I now understand after 2 years of therapy to be a textbook enabler, the person whose entire emotional job was smoothing the room after my father's moods. My older brother, Chris, was from as early as I can remember, the golden child. Not because he was particularly gifted at construction or business, he wasn't. And I say that with love because Chris and I have actually repaired our relationship since all of this happened. But because Gerald needed an heir, a narrative, a son who'd take over the company and prove the Bennett name meant something. Chris got the truck at 16. Chris got invited to client dinners at 22, straight out of a business degree he'd mostly coasted through. Chris got a vice president of operations title in 2009 for a job that, functionally, I was already doing. I got a different role. I was the scapegoat, the one everyone quietly agreed was the reason things went wrong, even on the occasions when the facts said otherwise. If a job ran over budget, it was because I'd miscoded something in QuickBooks. If a client complained about a delay, it was because I hadn't followed up on a permit fast enough. If cash flow was tight in a given month, my father would say, in front of the whole office, we wouldn't be in this position if Rachel actually understood how money works. I want to give you a specific number because I think specificity is the only thing that cuts through how normal all of this felt from the inside. Between 2010, when I formally took over as office manager and bookkeeper, and 2021, when I resigned, I was paid an average of $41,000 a year for a role that, according to a Dallas area staffing firm's compensation study, Deborah, my attorney, more on her shortly, later had me pull for the civil case, should have paid between $68,000 and $79,000 annually for a company of Bennett Craft Builders' size and revenue. Chris, doing considerably less of the actual operational work, was paid $91,000 a year, plus a truck allowance and a discretionary bonus that averaged another $12,000. I knew, on some level, that this was unfair. I brought it up exactly twice in 11 years. Both times my father's response was some version of the same sentence. You'll understand when you're running things yourself someday why it doesn't work that way yet. There was never a someday. There was only ever a promise of one, dangled just far enough ahead to keep me showing up. Here's how the trust, and I use that word carefully because it's a strange kind of trust, built more on fear and hope than affection, actually got built into something exploitable. In 2012, my father asked me to become a personal guarantor on a business line of credit with Frost Bank, an $80,000 facility meant to smooth out the seasonal cash flow gaps that are completely normal in residential construction. Payroll needs to go out on schedule even when a client's draw payment is running 2 weeks behind. He framed it exactly the way you'd expect a business owner to frame it to a trusted employee. It's just a formality, Rach. Chris is on it too. It protects the company. I signed. I didn't ask to see Chris's signature on the same document, and it turns out, I only learned this during discovery, 9 years later, that Chris never actually signed that particular guarantor agreement. My father told each of us the other one had already signed, a small, almost throwaway lie that meant neither of us ever compared notes. I remember the actual signing clearly because it happened at our kitchen table on a Sunday evening, not at a bank branch, which in hindsight should have registered as unusual. My father had brought the paperwork home rather than having us come into the branch together, the way you'd expect for a facility with both our names on it. He set the packet in front of me, already flagged with sticky arrows at the signature lines, the way you'd hand a customer a form you'd already filled out for them at a car dealership. Just sign where I marked it, he said, refilling his coffee, already moving on to the next thing before I'd even picked up the pen. I asked at the time whether I should read the whole thing first. He said, without looking up from the stove, "It's the same language as always, Rach. You've seen these before." I hadn't, actually. It was the first personal guarantor agreement I'd ever signed in my life, but I didn't want to seem like I was second-guessing him in front of my own kitchen. So I signed where the arrows pointed and handed it back. That's 29 years old me, at a kitchen table on a Sunday, trading 15 minutes of mild discomfort about seeming distrustful for a legal obligation I wouldn't fully understand the shape of for another 9 years. That's red flag number one, and it's one I want to name clearly because it recurs constantly in family financial exploitation cases, isolating each family member's understanding of a shared financial obligation so no two people in the family ever have the same complete picture. It doesn't require sophisticated forgery. It just requires everyone assuming someone else already checked. The second mechanism was subtler, and it took me the longest to see clearly, even after everything else came apart. My father used my role as scapegoat not just to deflect blame, but to keep me too emotionally depleted to audit my own situation. This is the part that isn't in most fraud prevention checklists because it's psychological rather than procedural. But I promise you, it's just as real a vulnerability. If you spend every week absorbing blame for problems you didn't cause, you don't have bandwidth left to ask hard, precise questions about your own paycheck, your own credit, your own name on documents you signed in a hurry between two other fires you were being blamed for. I remember specifically a stretch in 2015 when 3 separate projects ran over budget in the same quarter, not because of anything I'd done, I understand now, but because my father had personally negotiated unrealistic fixed-price contracts with 2 difficult clients and had shorted a subcontractor payment on a third to cover a personal expense I wouldn't learn about for 6 more years. He called a meeting in front of Chris and 2 site supervisors and said, "I don't know what's going on with the books lately, but somebody's not paying attention." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room, including me, understood exactly who he meant. I went home that night and reorganized our entire chart of accounts, working until 2 in the morning trying to find whatever mistake I must have made. I never found one. I told myself I must have just missed it, that the mistake was real and I simply wasn't good enough to locate my own error. That pattern, genuine competence met with manufactured self-doubt, repeated for years, and it's what made the actual moment money started disappearing almost impossible for me to notice, because I had already been trained to assume any discrepancy was my fault rather than evidence of someone else's hand in the account. The moment that mattered most, in hindsight, the one Deborah's forensic accountant eventually identified as the real starting point of the fraud, as opposed to the ordinary dysfunction that preceded it, was March of 2016. That's when my father asked me to sign what he described as updated HR paperwork, a routine-sounding packet reauthorizing direct deposit and updating tax withholding after the company switched payroll providers from ADP to a smaller regional service called Lone Star Payroll Solutions. Buried on page 6 of that packet, in language I skimmed past at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, while also fielding 3 site supervisor calls, was a limited power of attorney clause authorizing the company's designated financial officer, my father, as it turned out, since Bennett Craft Builders had never actually appointed anyone to that title in writing, to open and manage financial accounts in connection with payroll administration and employee benefits on my behalf. I signed it because I trusted him. I signed it because I was tired and blamed and eager to just get one more task off my desk without another meeting about how I wasn't paying attention. I had just given my father a legal foothold to open financial accounts using my identity dressed up as an ordinary HR form. I want to go back further, though, because I don't think the 2016 HR packet is really where this started. I think it started decades earlier in ways that only became legible to me once Dr. Patel introduced me to the concept of family systems roles. And I think it's worth walking through because if you're watching this and something about Scapegoat already feels uncomfortably familiar, this might be the part that resonates most. I was 9 years old the first time I remember being formally blamed in front of the whole family for something that demonstrably wasn't my fault. It was Thanksgiving 1992. My father had forgotten to pick up the turkey from the butcher he'd pre-ordered from, a fact my mother had reminded him about twice that week. When the dinner ran 2 hours behind schedule in front of my grandmother, my aunt, and both my siblings, my father said Rachel was supposed to remind me this morning. I had never been told any such thing. I was 9. I don't think, looking back, my father even fully believed the accusation himself in the moment. I think it was closer to reflex, a script he reached for automatically, the way some people reach for a specific phrase under stress. But I remember with total clarity the feeling of every adult in that room turning to look at me, and the feeling, even at 9, of deciding it was easier to simply absorb the blame than to argue with an adult who was already frustrated. That moment repeated in different forms for the next 3 decades. A missed Little League practice blamed on me for not reminding him at 11. A late mortgage payment on the family home blamed on me for distracting him with a school project at 14. By the time I was an adult working inside his business, the pattern wasn't new. It was just wearing a QuickBooks login instead of a school backpack. I also want to describe the mechanism by which Chris, meanwhile, became genuinely convinced of his own competence, because I think it's the flip side of the same coin. Understanding it helped me stop, eventually, resenting him for it. Chris wasn't lying when he accepted credit for work I'd largely done. He'd been told consistently since childhood that he was the capable one, the one who'd run things someday. Told so consistently by both our parents that I don't think he ever had strong reason to interrogate it. It wasn't until the civil discovery process, when Chris sat through his own deposition and how to answer, under oath, specific operational questions about the business he'd nominally run for over a decade, that he began to understand how much of his own competence had actually been built on my uncredited work. He told me afterward, in the parking garage outside Deborah's office, that it was one of the more disorienting afternoons of his life, realizing in real time how many answers he genuinely didn't have. There's one more mechanism I want to name before we move forward in the timeline, because it's specific to family businesses and I think it deserves its own call-out: the informal loan that never gets formally closed out. In 2014, 2 years before the HR packet, my father asked me for what he described as a short-term personal loan of $9,000 to cover what he said was an unexpected tax bill. I wrote him a check for my personal savings. He never repaid it in cash. Instead, over the following years, whenever I mentioned it, he'd respond with some version of, "I've been covering that through your bonus structure," a vague, unverifiable claim I had no way to check against actual numbers, since I, despite literally running the company's books, was never shown my own complete compensation history broken out by category. That $9,000, it turned out, during Marcus's later reconstruction, was never repaid in any form. It simply became one more small, permanent hole that I'd been trained not to keep asking about. Let's fast forward to April of 2021, the week I resigned. Before I get to that week, though, I want to give you a clearer picture of the business itself during those middle years, because the scale and complexity of Bennett Craft Builders is part of why the exploitation was able to hide in plain sight for as long as it did. When I formally took over the books in 2010, the company was building 6 to 8 custom homes a year, with revenue around $1.8 million and a handful of subcontractor relationships I could track on a single spreadsheet. By 2016, the year of the HR packet, we'd grown to 14 or 15 projects a year, closer to $4.2 million in annual revenue, with our own small crew of framers and finished carpenters, alongside a rotating roster of specialty subcontractors, electricians, HVAC, stonemasons, each with their own draw schedules, lien waivers, and payment terms. By 2019, the year of the equipment financing and the McKinney HELOC, we were regularly running 18 to 20 projects simultaneously across 3 North Texas counties with revenue over $6.5 million and a level of financial complexity, construction draws tied to specific project milestones, retainage held back on subcontractor payments, equipment depreciation schedules that made it considerably easier for a handful of fraudulent accounts to blend into the ordinary noise of legitimate financial activity than it would have been in the smaller business I'd started managing in 2010. I think about that growth curve often, the same way I now understand a lot of family exploitation cases work. The business becoming more complex didn't make the fraud more visible, it made it less visible because complexity itself became camouflage, and because I, the person best positioned to notice irregularities, was simultaneously being trained project after project to distrust my own read of the numbers. I also want to describe a few more of the specific, smaller mechanisms that kept the whole system running, because I think the general shape of "he built trust and exploited it" undersells how mundane most of it felt while it was happening. My father was, genuinely, generous in certain narrow, highly visible ways. He paid for my daughter's braces in 2017 without being asked. He covered the cost of a family cruise for my 40th birthday in 2023 that notably happened after all of this had already come to light, in what I now recognize as an attempt to reestablish the old narrative. Those gestures were real in the sense that money genuinely changed hands. They also functioned, I understand now, as a kind of ongoing proof of concept for the story he told about himself, generous father, difficult daughter, that made the quieter, much larger financial exploitation harder for anyone, including me, to reconcile with the man who just paid for orthodontia without complaint. There was also a specific pattern around performance reviews, if you can call them that in a small family business, informal conversations, usually right before a major project closed out, where my father would raise some version of the same complaint about my attention to detail, timed consistently in a way I only recognized in hindsight, almost always within a week or two of a fraudulent draw or account opening. Marcus's later reconstruction found that 11 of the 14 largest unauthorized transactions occurred within 10 days of a documented instance of my father criticizing my financial competence in front of other staff. It wasn't a coincidence. It was, Marcus told me directly, a pattern consistent with someone using conflict as cover, creating a plausible, emotionally charged distraction at almost exactly the moments he needed my attention elsewhere. I want to tell you about the specific therapy session that finally cracked all of this open for me, because I think it's the piece of this story that has resonated most with people who've messaged me since, more even than the dollar figures. I started seeing Dr. Anita Patel in January of 2021, initially for what I told myself was general work stress. 3 sessions in, describing yet another incident where my father had blamed me in front of Chris and a client for a scheduling delay that Marcus would later confirm was entirely of my father's own making, Dr. Patel asked me a question I'd genuinely never been asked before. Rachel, if you're the reason the company struggles, why does it seem to struggle worse every year you work harder to fix it? I remember sitting in her office, a converted bungalow near White Rock Lake, and realizing I didn't have an answer. Not a good one, not a bad one, nothing. 22 years of assuming the fault was mine, and I couldn't actually produce a single piece of evidence for it when asked directly. She introduced me over the following weeks to the concept of family systems roles: the scapegoat, the golden child, the enabler, the lost child, the hero. Not as a diagnosis, she was careful to say, but as a framework that might help me see patterns I'd spent decades living inside without being able to name. The moment that mattered most came in March, when she asked me to write down, without editing myself, every specific incident I could remember where I'd been blamed for something and later learned with certainty that the faults lay elsewhere. I filled 11 pages in one sitting. 11 pages, going back to a Thanksgiving turkey in 1992. That list is, in a very real sense, the first document in this entire investigation. It predates the credit reports, the forensic accounting, the document examiner's report. It's just a list, in my own handwriting, of a pattern I'd never had permission, from myself, let alone anyone else, to fully see. I resigned 3 weeks after finishing it. Let's return to April of 2021, the week I resigned. I didn't discover any of this while I still worked at Bennett Crafts Builders. I discovered it after I resigned, and I think that fact alone tells you something important about how thoroughly the scapegoat role had been designed to keep me from looking too closely while I was still inside it. I resigned on April 9th, 2021, by email at 11 in the morning after a Sunday dinner the night before, where my father had, in front of my mother, Chris, and Chris's wife, spent 20 minutes explaining to the table why a permit delay on a Frisco job, caused, I found out 18 months later, by my father personally missing a filing deadline while he was on a golf trip, was the kind of thing that keeps happening when Rachel's in charge of the paperwork. I sat there, 42 years old, and something in me simply stopped absorbing it. I went home, I didn't sleep, and at 11 the next morning, I typed a 2-paragraph resignation email and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. The company owed me, per Texas final paycheck law, my last wages within 6 days of resignation, along with a payout of accrued but unused pay time off per company policy. 11 days, roughly $1,700. My father dragged his feet on it for 3 weeks, which at the time I read as one more small cruelty in a long pattern, nothing more. When the check finally arrived, I noticed something odd on the accompanying pay stub, a line item labeled 401k loan repayment recurring, deducting $81 from a retirement account balance I hadn't known existed. I called Lone Star Payroll Solutions directly, expecting an easy correction. What I got instead, after being transferred twice, was a payroll specialist reading me the balance and loan history on a Bennett Crafts Builders 401k account under my name that I never enrolled in, showing an outstanding loan balance of $14,600 taken out in November of 2018. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, saying, "That's not possible. I never signed up for a 401k. The specialist, not unkindly, told me the enrollment and loan paperwork were both on file, both bearing my signature, both processed through the designated financial officer authorization on record. The same clause, though I didn't know it yet, buried on page 6 of that HR packet from 2016. That phone call is what sent me that same week to pull my full credit reports from all 3 bureaus for the first time in years. What I found rewired everything I thought I understood about my own family. There was a Bank of America personal line of credit, $18,000 limit, opened in August of 2017, currently drawn to just under $16,000, with a payment history showing consistent minimum payments, meaning someone had been actively managing it, not simply draining and abandoning it, for over 3 years, entirely without my knowledge. There was a second, larger item. I was listed as a personal guarantor alongside Chris on a construction equipment financing agreement through Caterpillar Financial Services for a $110,000 excavator and skid steer package purchased in 2019. Equipment that, as far as I could tell from later records, had actually been used almost exclusively on a spec home my father built for himself, a lake house on Grapevine Lake that was never listed as a company asset. And then there was the account that, once I understood it, made me sit down on my kitchen floor. A home equity line of credit against a rental property in McKinney that my grandmother, my father's mother, had left jointly to me and Chris in her 2014 will. specifically because she told me more than once before she passed that she worried about how the family treated me and wanted to make sure you always have something that's really yours, Rachel, that nobody can take a piece of. The HELOC had been opened in 2019, was drawn to $62,000, and required, per the credit union's own file, both my signature and Chris's on the original application. I called Chris that same night. He had no idea it existed either. And that's when I found the smoking gun. Because once Chris and I started comparing notes, for the first time in either of our adult lives, actually comparing our separate, isolated understandings of the family finances, we discovered something our father had never anticipated. Neither of us had ever been shown the other's actual signature on any of these documents. When we finally obtained copies through the credit union and through Discovery, both of our signatures on the McKinney property HELOC were unmistakably in the same handwriting. Not mine, not Chris's. A third, careful, practiced hand that a forensic document examiner would later identify with what she described in her report as a high degree of confidence as a forgery consistent with a specific set of formation habits my father's own known signature shared, particularly a distinctive backward loop on the capital R that appeared unconsciously in both his real signature and the forged versions of mine. The scale of it, once Chris and I, and eventually a forensic accountant named Marcus Whitfield, had fully reconstructed it, broke down like this: $14,600 in an unauthorized 401k loan, $15,800 drawn against the fraudulent Bank of America line of credit, $110,000 in equipment financing I had unknowingly guaranteed, used for a personal asset rather than the business, $62,000 drawn against the McKinney property HELOC, secured against an inheritance my own grandmother had specifically tried to protect for me. And underneath all of it, once Marcus dug into 11 years of payroll and tax records, the largest single piece, $173,820 in underpaid wages and misclassified payroll tax withholding. My father had, for years, classified a portion of my compensation as a contractor stipend rather than W-2 wages, a classification that let the company avoid its share of payroll tax obligations, while I, unknowingly, absorbed a self-employment tax liability on income I'd never actually received as a contractor. Total, $376,220, taken, misdirected, or manufactured against my name and my labor over roughly 9 years. I confronted my father on a Thursday afternoon in June of 2021 at his office at Bennett Craft Builders, the office I'd worked beside for over a decade. I brought copies of everything: the credit reports, the forged HELOC signature comparison, the payroll misclassification summary Marcus had put together in a preliminary format. He didn't deny the numbers. What he said instead, and I've had this sentence sitting in my chest for 3 years now, was, "Everything I did was to keep this company alive for this family, Rachel. You've always made everything about yourself. This business is going to be Chris's someday, and you resigned like it meant nothing to you." I asked him, directly, how long the HR packet clause had been in place and whether he'd used it for anything beyond the 401k and the accounts I already knew about. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he said, "You have no idea what it takes to keep a construction company solvent through a housing slowdown. I made decisions. I always intended to make it right, eventually." I asked him what eventually was supposed to mean, since I'd been hearing some version of that word my entire life, attached to promises about the business, about my compensation, about when things would finally be fair. He didn't have an answer for that either. He looked, for a moment, genuinely uncertain, the first time I could remember seeing that particular expression on his face, before it hardened back into something more familiar. "You've always been the one who couldn't just trust the process, Rachel. Chris trusts me. Your mother trusts me. It's always been you who needed everything spelled out and documented like you're building a case against your own father." I told him that was, as it turned out, exactly what I was doing. I told him I was consulting an attorney. He laughed, the same laugh I'd heard my whole childhood, the one that meant he'd already decided the conversation was over and I was, once again, being unreasonable. "Go ahead," he said. "You think anyone's going to believe the daughter who quit in the middle of a project, screaming about being a victim, over the man who built this whole company from nothing? You've always needed a villain, Rachel. I'm not going to keep playing him." That sentence, the accusation that I needed a villain, that my own documented forgeries and misclassified taxes were somehow a role I was casting him into, rather than a crime he had actually committed, was, I understand now, the same mechanism that had kept me quiet for 22 years deployed one more time at full strength the moment it mattered most. It didn't work this time, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't relying on his version of events. I had the documents. I need to describe what the weeks immediately after that confrontation actually looked like, because the damage moved outward fast through the whole family in ways the dollar figures alone don't capture. My husband, Aaron, had a reaction I still think about often. Aaron's an accountant himself, a controller for a logistics company in Fort Worth, and when I first showed him the credit reports at our kitchen table, he went very quiet for a long time, the particular quiet of someone whose professional training is telling him exactly how bad something is faster than his emotional processing can keep up with. He asked me eventually, "How long have you been the one they've blamed for the numbers not working?" When I told him it went back to childhood, not just the job, he said something that stayed with me since. "Rachel, I've watched you catch a $200 reconciliation error in another department in about 4 minutes. There is no version of you that's actually bad with money. That was never true." Telling Chris was harder than I expected, not because I doubted he'd believe me, the documents made belief almost beside the point, but because I had spent over a decade quietly resenting him for a golden child role I now understood he hadn't fully chosen either. We met at a coffee shop in Frisco, and I remember sliding the McKinney HELOC signature comparison across the table and watching his face change as he actually looked, for what he told me was the first time in years, at a document with his own name on it. He said I never even read this when I signed it. I just trusted Dad handled the details. I told him I understood completely because I'd done the same thing more times than I could count. It was, oddly, the first moment of real solidarity Chris and I had shared as adults, both of us finally comparing our separate, incomplete pictures of the same family and finding they matched in a way that made the whole shape of it undeniable. I also want to describe what it was like to reconnect, even briefly, with former coworkers at Bennett Craft Builders during this period, because their reactions taught me something about how visible parts of this had actually been, even to people outside the family who'd had no reason to look closely. I called a site supervisor named Danny Ruiz, who'd worked for my father for nearly 15 years, mostly to ask a factual question about a project timeline for Marcus's reconstruction. Near the end of the call, almost as an aside, Danny said, "You know, I always thought it was weird your dad handled certain accounts himself instead of routing everything through you, given you ran everything else." He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Why would he? It wasn't his place to question his boss's internal financial arrangements. But hearing it confirmed something Marcus had already found in the records. My father had, on a small number of specific accounts, deliberately kept the paperwork routed through a P.O. box rather than the office, ensuring that even routine mail wouldn't cross my desk the way virtually everything else did. I also reached out to Bennett Craft Builders' longtime front office assistant, a woman named Carla, who'd worked alongside me for almost a decade before retiring in 2020. Carla cried on the phone when I told her what we'd found, not from shock, she said, but from a kind of delayed recognition.
I used to think it was strange how hard he was on you about the books when you were clearly the only one of the three of us who actually understood them, she said. I told myself it wasn't my business. Neither Danny nor Carla had done anything wrong by staying quiet. They had no authority to demand access to accounts they weren't shown and no way of knowing what, specifically, they were looking at. But hearing both of them independently describe the same quiet unease was one more confirmation that the isolation my father built around those specific accounts hadn't been accidental. It had been engineered carefully around exactly the people, including me, who might otherwise have noticed sooner. Telling my mother was, by far, the most difficult conversation, and it didn't go the way I'd hoped. When Erin and I sat down with her in July of 2021, laying out the documents as gently as we could, her first response wasn't shock or anger at my father. It was a kind of reflexive defense I recognized instantly because I'd absorbed the same instinct myself for 30 years. He's always handled the money, Rachel. I'm sure there's an explanation. You know how he gets when he feels criticized. I left that conversation more shaken than the confrontation with my father itself had left me, because it confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to fully accept. The scapegoat role hadn't just been maintained by my father. It had been maintained by an entire family system, including people who loved me, because questioning it would have required questioning far more than just the numbers. My mother's position shifted slowly over the following months as more documentation accumulated, and as Chris, who she'd never doubted the way she doubted me, began independently confirming the same facts. By October, as I'll get to shortly, she made a choice that meaningfully helped the case. But I want to be honest that the initial instinct, even from a parent who I believe genuinely loves me, was to protect the family narrative rather than immediately believe the child, who'd always been cast as the unreliable one. That's a specific, painful texture of family financial exploitation that doesn't show up in stranger fraud stories, and I think it deserves to be named plainly rather than smoothed over for the sake of a cleaner narrative. The financial fallout widened in practical ways too. My credit score, once the fraudulent accounts appeared formally in dispute status across all three bureaus, dropped from a 762 to a 641 within the first 4 months, before I'd had time to get the disputes resolved. Erin and I had been pre-approved for a home renovation loan that summer, refinancing to add a bedroom before our second child arrived. That pre-approval was pulled in August once the new derogatory marks hit my file, and we ended up postponing the renovation for over a year, financing a smaller version of the project out of pocket at a considerably higher effective cost than the loan we'd lost. It was one more reminder that fraud like this doesn't just cost you the stolen total. It costs you every subsequent financial decision that becomes harder, slower, and more expensive because your name has been contaminated by someone else's choices. My mother's shift, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a single conversation. It arrived in fragments over months, in a way that felt at times like watching someone slowly wake up from a very long sleep. In August, she called to ask, carefully, whether the McKinney property had really been my grandmother's specific wish for me, since she said she remembered the will discussion differently. I sent her a copy of the actual will language. She didn't call back for several days after that. In September, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd started noticing how often my father described me using words like difficult or sensitive in conversations with her friends. Words she said she'd simply absorbed as fact for so long, she'd never stopped to ask where they came from or whether they were true. By the time Detective Okafor interviewed her in October, my mother had done something I don't think she'd done in 3 decades of marriage. She'd started keeping her own quiet, private notes. Dates, comments, small inconsistencies she'd noticed over the years, but never written down because writing them down would have meant admitting she'd noticed them at all. She showed me that notebook once, months later, sitting at her kitchen table. I didn't ask to keep it. I understood, looking at her handwriting filling page after page, that it belonged to her, and that whatever it represented, grief, guilt, a decades-late reckoning with her own role in maintaining a story that had cost her daughter this much, wasn't mine to take from her, even if some of what she'd written eventually became useful to Deborah's case. After that conversation in his office, I made the same decision that I now tell everyone in this situation to make, even though it goes against every instinct a scapegoat has spent a lifetime building. I stopped trying to resolve this with him directly, and I started building a file. The first call was to an attorney, a Dallas-based civil litigator named Deborah Ashcroft, no relation to the Deborah in cases some of you may remember from other stories on this channel, just a coincidence of a common name, who specialized in family business disputes and financial exploitation. Deborah's first instruction mirrored what I now understand is close to universal advice in cases like this. Document everything, communicate with your father only in writing from this point forward, and do not, under any circumstances, sign anything else related to Bennett Craft Builders without her reviewing it first. Step 1. Fold records requests. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, I was entitled to complete transaction histories on the Bank of America line of credit and the McKinney HELOC. Under ERISA disclosure rules, I was entitled to the complete enrollment and loan documentation for the 401k account. It took roughly 7 weeks and several follow-up letters from Deborah's office, but eventually I had itemized records for every fraudulent or misused account. Step 2. The payroll reconstruction. This is where Marcus Whitfield, the forensic accountant, became essential. He pulled 11 years of W-2s, 1099 forms, and internal payroll registers from Lone Star Payroll Solutions and its predecessor provider, and built what he called a compensation reconciliation, comparing what Bennett Craft Builders had actually paid me, in what form, against Bureau of Labor Statistics wage data for comparable roles in the Dallas-Fort Worth construction sector, and against what the company's own internal budgets, which Marcus subpoenaed during the civil discovery process, had allocated for my position versus what was actually dispersed. The gap, compounded over 9 years with the misclassified contractor stipend portion factored in separately, came to that $173,820 figure. Aaron became part of this process in a way neither of us anticipated when we got married. His background as a controller meant he understood exactly how to read the payroll registers Marcus was working through, and over that summer, he built, on his own initiative, a master timeline spreadsheet cross-referencing every source we had access to: bank statement dates, the credit bureau dispute timeline, my father's own social media posts and check-ins from trips he'd taken during the relevant years, our family group text history going back to 2016, even school calendars for my niece's gymnastics program once that connection became relevant. He color-coded the way he organizes his own department's audit trails at work, and it grew to well over 900 rows by the time we handed a version of it to Deborah. That spreadsheet wasn't itself admissible evidence, but Deborah told us afterward it functioned as an invaluable index, letting her and Marcus move quickly to the specific underlying documents that mattered most, instead of working through everything in the order it happened to surface. I remember those evenings clearly. Aaron at our dining table with his laptop after our kids were asleep, cross-referencing dates late into the night, not saying much, just quietly helping me hold a truth that would otherwise have been almost too large to carry alone. We didn't talk directly most of those nights about how it was affecting us. We just worked. I understand now that the working was, in its own way, how we were talking. Step 3. The documents examiner. Deborah retained a certified forensic document examiner, Linda Ferreira, to formally compare the signatures on the McKinney HELOC, the Caterpillar Equipment Guarantee, and the original 2016 HR packet against verified samples of my actual signature, Chris's actual signature, and, obtained through a subpoena for corporate filing records, several documents indisputably signed by my father in his own name. Linda's report, which ran to over 40 pages, identified consistent formation habits across the forged signatures and my father's known handwriting, pressure patterns, letter spacing, and that distinctive backward loop on capital letters that showed up in his own name and subtly in every forged version of mine and Chris's. And that's when I found the second smoking gun. Because during discovery, Deborah's office subpoenaed the internal messaging records from a company-issued phone my father had used for years, and buried in a group text thread with 2 site supervisors from 2019, a thread mostly about scheduling and subcontractor logistics, was a message that had nothing to do with either. Responding to a supervisor who'd apparently asked, offhand, how the McKinney property refinance was going, my father had written, "Almost done. Rachel and Chris don't even know what's happening. Easier that way. She never checks anything anyway, too busy blaming herself for the Frisco delay. LOL." I want to describe what it felt like to read that message because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. It wasn't just proof of the fraud. Marcus and Linda had already given me that. It was proof that my father had understood in real time exactly what role he'd built for me and had used it consciously as an operational tool. "She never checks anything anyway, too busy blaming herself," isn't a sentence a person writes about a system they built and are actively exploiting. 22 years of "you're not good with money" collapsed in that single text message into what it had actually been the entire time. A cover story, maintained on purpose for a man who understood precisely how competent I was and needed me to doubt it anyway. Step 4. Law enforcement and regulatory complaints. Deborah and I filed a formal complaint with the Collin County Financial Crimes Unit alongside a parallel identity theft complaint with the FTC and an IC3 complaint with the FBI, given that several of the fraudulent account applications had been submitted online. Because the wage misclassification touched on payroll tax obligations, we also filed a complaint with the Texas Workforce Commission, which has independent authority to investigate wage and unemployment insurance fraud. And that complaint is what ultimately produced the hearing where the $376,000 figure first entered a formal record.
Detective Renee Okafa, who caught the criminal referral, told me something in our first meeting that I've repeated to several people since. Family financial exploitation cases involving adult children are chronically underreported and underprosecuted, not because the evidence is typically weak, but because so many victims have spent years being trained inside the family system itself to doubt whether what happened to them even qualifies as a crime rather than just how families are. She said the cases that move fastest through her unit are the ones where the victim arrives with organized documentation rather than an emotional account alone. Not because the emotional account isn't true, but because organized documentation lets an already overloaded unit act on the case immediately instead of spending months just establishing the basic facts. There were near misses, and I want to be honest about them because this didn't move in a straight line toward justice any more than my previous stories on this channel have. Near miss number 1. In August of 2021, roughly 2 months after our confrontation, my father attempted to refinance the McKinney property HELOC into a new loan under a slightly restructured LLC, Bennett's Family Holdings, too. Apparently trying to move the debt into a fresh legal entity before Deborah's office could formally freeze it. The refinance was blocked only because the new lender's underwriter flagged that the existing HELOC listed 2 guarantors whose signatures didn't match the application's notarization records closely enough to clear an automated fraud screen, the same kind of detection process that in my last story on this channel caught a similar attempt. It's a pattern worth knowing about if you're ever in this position. Fraud that survived one lender's scrutiny for years often does not survive a second lender looking at it fresh. Near miss number 2, and the one that unsettled me most. In October of 2021, my mother, Diane, who throughout this entire process maintained in her words that she just didn't get involved in the business side of things, was approached by my father to co-sign a personal loan intended, he told her, to cover some legal fees while this misunderstanding with Rachel gets sorted out. Had that loan gone through and been drawn down before the civil freeze order Deborah eventually secured, it could have meaningfully complicated asset recovery, since jointly held marital funds are harder to attach than individually held ones under Texas community property law.
my mother, to her credit, and this was the beginning of what's become a slow, still difficult repair in our relationship, called me directly to ask if this was connected to what was going on before she signed anything. It was the first time in my adult life she had checked with me before checking with him. By December of 2021, the Collin County District Attorney's Office had opened a formal criminal investigation into forgery and financial exploitation, and Deborah had filed a civil suit on my behalf, seeking full restitution, a formal accounting of company finances, and my share of what remained of the McKinney property. The scapegoat role I'd been handed at 7 years old was, for the first time in 31 years, about to be cross-examined in a courtroom instead of a family dinner. Before I take you into that courtroom, I want to walk through what the months of trial preparation actually involved, because as I've said in other stories on this channel, the work doesn't end once law enforcement is involved. In some ways, it intensifies. I sat for my own deposition in the civil case in February of 2022, nearly 5 hours across 2 sessions, with Robert Kessler asking question after question designed to establish the disgruntled former employee narrative before it could be raised at trial. He asked repeatedly about the timing of my resignation relative to the Frisco delay, clearly trying to suggest I'd manufactured a fraud narrative out of embarrassment or spite following a workplace failure. Deborah had prepared me extensively for exactly this line of questioning, and her advice mirrored something I now tell everyone in a similar position. Answer only the question asked, don't fill silences with explanation, and let the documents, not your emotional account, carry the weight of proving intent and timeline. At one point, Kessler asked whether it was true that I had a documented history of workplace performance concerns at Bennett Craft Builders. I said plainly, I have a documented history of being blamed for performance concerns. Those aren't the same thing, and I can show you the underlying numbers for any specific incident you'd like to raise. Deborah told me afterward that answer did more for my credibility in that deposition than any amount of visible frustration would have, because it drew the exact distinction the entire case ultimately turned on, between a genuine performance record and a manufactured narrative about one. I also want to tell you about my mother's decision in October of 2021, because I mentioned it briefly earlier and I think it deserves more space. After the attempted loan co-signing that Deborah's office intercepted, my mother did something that, for her, was genuinely unprecedented. She agreed to be interviewed voluntarily by Detective Okafor, and she disclosed, unprompted, that she had personally witnessed my father filling out paperwork at the kitchen table on at least 2 occasions, using what she described as practicing my signature, he said, so the bank wouldn't ask questions about matching handwriting between kids' documents. She hadn't understood at the time what she was watching. She understood it clearly by October of 2021, and her willingness to say so on the record became a meaningful piece of corroborating testimony alongside Linda Ferreira's formal document analysis. That disclosure cost my mother something significant in her marriage and in her own sense of the family story she'd maintained for decades, and I don't take it lightly. It was, in its own way, the beginning of her stepping out of the enabler role, the same way I'd stepped out of the scapegoat role 7 months earlier. Much later, much more hesitantly, but genuinely. There was one more near miss during this period that I haven't mentioned yet. In January of 2022, roughly a month before trial, my father's defense team located a former Bennett Craft Builders bookkeeper, a woman named Patricia, who'd briefly covered my role during a medical leave in 2013 and prepared to call her as a witness to testify that she'd personally observed financial disorganization in my record-keeping during that period, an attempt to seed doubt about my general competence with the company's books before the jury ever heard the forgery evidence. Deborah tracked down and interviewed Patricia herself ahead of the defense's formal disclosure deadline, and it turned out Patricia's actual recollection, once walked through the specific records from that 6-week period, was of a temporary backlog caused by the payroll provider transition. The same 2016 transition, it turned out, during which my father had introduced the HR packet containing the authorization clause, not any disorganization attributable to me. Once Deborah presented Patricia with the actual dated records, Patricia herself grew uncomfortable with how her recollection was being characterized, and Kessler ultimately withdrew her from the witness list rather than risk testimony that, once specifics were introduced, would reinforce the prosecution's timeline instead of undermining mine. The criminal case moved differently than a typical stranger fraud prosecution, and I want to walk you through that difference because I think it's genuinely useful for anyone watching who's dealing with financial exploitation inside a family rather than from an outsider. Because the case touched forgery, wage and tax misclassification, and a fraudulently obtained equipment financing guarantee, it moved across 3 separate tracks simultaneously: the Collin County criminal case for forgery, a Texas Workforce Commission administrative proceeding for the payroll violations, and Deborah's civil suit for restitution and an accounting. My father's attorney, a well-regarded Dallas defense lawyer named Robert Kessler, initially tried to fold all of it into a single narrative for a jury, that this was a family business dispute, exaggerated by a disgruntled former employee following a bitter resignation, not a criminal matter. That narrative held together reasonably well, right up until the forensic document examiner's testimony, and it fell apart entirely once ADA Wanda Coleman introduced the site supervisor text thread. And that's when I found the moment that actually ended the case. Wanda read the message to the jury exactly as it had been recovered. Almost done. Rachel and Chris don't even know it's happening. Easier that way. She never checks anything anyway, too busy blaming herself for the Frisco delay, LOL. She paused, deliberately after reading it, then asked Linda Ferreira, still on the stand from her document examination testimony, a single follow-up question: whether a message written contemporaneously with a forged transaction describing the victim's specific psychological state as a reason the forgery would go undetected was consistent with premeditated concealment rather than an accounting oversight. Linda's answer was simple: yes. I watched 3 jurors look directly at my father when that message was read. I watched Robert Kessler's expression shift the way I imagine any experienced defense attorney does when a piece of evidence lands in a way no amount of prior strategy fully prepared for. My father took the stand 2 days later, a decision Kessler clearly felt was necessary once the text message had already been entered into the record. On direct examination, he described a version of events centered on the company's genuine cash flow struggles during the 2018 and 2019 housing slowdown in North Texas, characterized the McKinney HELOC as an intended short-term bridge he'd always planned to disclose once the timing was better, and described the equipment financing as a business decision that had simply been misfiled under the wrong asset category. Wanda's cross-examination lasted just under an hour, and she built almost all of it from his own prior statements, the text message, and a set of financial disclosures he'd separately filed with Frost Bank 2 years earlier, in which he'd listed the McKinney property as wholly company-owned, directly contradicting both the actual deed and his own trial testimony about always intending to disclose the arrangement to me and Chris. She asked him directly, "Mr. Bennett, at the time you drew $62,000 against a property your own mother left specifically to your daughter and son, did either of them know that draw was happening?" He paused for a long moment before answering, "Not at that specific time, no." Wanda pressed further. "And, in your own words, in a text message sent that same month, you described your daughter as someone who, quote, never checks anything anyway. Was that assessment something you were relying on when you made that draw?" He didn't answer for several seconds. Eventually he said, "I don't remember exactly what I meant by that." Wanda didn't let it go. "You don't need to remember what you meant, Mr. Bennett. I'm asking whether it's true. Did you rely on your daughter's trust in you and her tendency to doubt herself rather than you when you made these transactions?" "Yes," he finally said. "I suppose I did." I sat in the second row when he said that word. One syllable, the first time in 31 years he had said under oath without redirecting blame back toward my own signature or my own supposed carelessness that he had specifically counted on my self-doubt as an operational tool. It didn't undo anything, but it was, I've had to accept, the closest thing to an honest accounting I was ever going to get from him directly, and I've learned to let that be enough, because a fuller one was never coming. I want to describe the Texas Workforce Commission hearing itself in a bit more detail, since it ran on a different track than the criminal case and involved a somewhat different kind of preparation. Administrative hearings like this one are less formal than a criminal trial. No jury, a single hearing officer, evidentiary standards that allow for a more direct presentation of financial records, but they require an even more granular, line-by-line demonstration of the underlying numbers, since the entire proceeding turns on whether the wage and tax classifications themselves were correct, independent of anyone's intent. Marcus spent nearly 3 weeks preparing exhibits specifically for that hearing, building a year-by-year comparison table showing my W-2 wages, the separately issued 1099 contractor's stipend payments, and what my full compensation should have been classified as under Texas Workforce Commission guidelines for common law employment relationships. Factors like who controlled my schedule, who provided my tools and workspace, and whether I performed work integral to the core business, all of which pointed unambiguously toward employee status for the entire disputed period. The hearing officer, a TWC administrative law judge named Karen Whitmore, spent nearly 4 hours reviewing Marcus's exhibits alongside testimony from both Marcus and me before issuing a preliminary determination, later finalized, that the contractor stipend classification had been improper for the full period in question. That determination mattered enormously beyond the dollar figure itself because it created an independent quasi-judicial finding of fact issued by a state agency with its own investigatory authority entirely separate from the criminal case that corroborated the wage theft allegations at the center of both the criminal referral and the civil suit. Deborah told me afterward that having that kind of independent administrative finding in hand considerably strengthened the civil case's leverage during settlement discussions with Kessler, since it meant the wage figures were no longer just Marcus's reconstruction, they were also, now, an official state determination that Bennett Craft Builders itself never formally appealed. The jury convicted my father on 2 counts of forgery in connection with the McKinney HELOC and the Caterpillar equipment guarantee. The wage misclassification and payroll tax violations were resolved separately through the Texas Workforce Commission proceeding and a parallel referral to the IRS, resulting in a determination that Bennett Craft Builders owed back payroll taxes, penalties, and interest, with my $173,820 wage shortfall becoming the centerpiece of both the TWC's back pay order and the largest single component of Deborah's civil judgment. He was sentenced in March of 2022 to 5 years with 18 months to serve and the remainder on probation, along with a restitution order covering the full $376,220. Through the combination of the criminal restitution order, the TWC back pay determination, and the civil judgment, Deborah had structured specifically to allow enforcement across all 3 simultaneously, so that no single track's limitations would leave a gap in what I could actually collect. I want to tell you about the sentencing hearing itself, because it's where the story genuinely closed for me, more than the verdict did. Texas allows victims to deliver a statement directly to the court before sentencing, and I wrote mine over several nights without much editing because Deborah told me judges hear enough polished language in a given week and tend to respond more to something unvarnished. I told the judge that the hardest part of the $376,000 wasn't the number itself, even though it was enormous, even though it had cost Aaron and me a renovation, a year of financial strain, months of credit repair.
The hardest part was that I had spent 31 years believing a story about my own competence that turned out to have been constructed deliberately by the person telling it for his own benefit. I told the judge that rebuilding my ability to trust my own judgment about money, about my own perception of events, about whether a criticism aimed at me was fair or manufactured was going to take considerably longer than any restitution schedule, and that I was grateful the court could at least address the part of the damage that could be measured in dollars. My father was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He did not offer the kind of full apology I think some of you watching might hope for. He said he had made some decisions under financial pressure that he regretted, that he had always intended for the company to take care of everyone eventually, and that he hoped someday our family could move past this. He did not mention the text message about the Frisco delay. He did not mention the gymnastics tuition. Even facing sentencing, some part of him still seemed unable or unwilling to name what he'd actually done and why, in language that the evidence had already shown the court in plain terms. Judge Elena Ruiz addressed that gap directly before handing down the sentence. She noted, and I wrote this down immediately afterward, that what distinguished this case from an ordinary business dispute was, in her words, a documented pattern of financial exploitation deliberately structured around the victim's own psychological role within the family, sustained over multiple years, with contemporaneous written acknowledgement that the victim's specific vulnerabilities were being relied upon to avoid detection. She specifically cited the site supervisor text message as evidence that this was not a man who had lost control of a difficult financial situation, but a man who had, in her words, understood precisely what he was doing and to whom at every stage. That sentence, entered into the permanent record of a Collin County courtroom, is the thing I hold on to most now. Not because it punished my father, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter, but because it was the first time an entirely neutral credential authority looked at the full 31-year shape of it and said, on the record, this happened exactly the way you understood it to happen. You were never the problem. You were right. I want to mention briefly the question of publicity, because I get asked about it constantly now. Deborah advised against going public before sentencing for the same reasons attorneys generally give in cases like this. Pre-trial publicity risks tainting a jury pool and gives someone still capable of moving or concealing assets a clear signal to move faster than a civil freeze can keep pace with. We stayed quiet through the entire investigation and trial. The one exception came after sentencing, when a Dallas Morning News reporter covering Collin County court filings picked up the case from the public docket and reached out for comment. I agreed to a brief interview, disclosing the broad figures and describing the family role dynamic in general terms, both because I believed the case had real educational value for other people who might recognize a version of their own family in it, and because, after nearly a year of enforced silence, there was something clarifying about finally being able to say, on the record, exactly what had happened. The piece ran in April of 2022, and in the weeks after it published, I received 9 separate messages from other adult children of narcissistic parents describing strikingly similar financial patterns tucked inside similar family roles, several of whom told me the story prompted them to pull their own credit reports for the first time in years. 2 of them later told me what they found wasn't nothing. I want to be honest about the restitution. The way I've learned matters most in stories like this. A court ordering someone to pay you back and you actually receiving the money are 2 very different outcomes. And a lot of victims never see the second one. Deborah structured the civil judgment around specific identifiable assets from the beginning, rather than relying solely on my father's promise to pay. During discovery, we identified and moved to attach the McKinney rental property itself, which was ultimately sold with my and Chris's rightful ownership interest restored, and the fraudulent HELOC balance paid off directly from the sale proceeds, before any remaining equity was distributed. The excavator and skid steer equipment, which Caterpillar Financial Services repossessed and liquidated, with the outstanding guarantee balance credited against my restitution total. And after the TWC proceeding concluded, A structured payment plan against ongoing Bennett Craft Builders revenue. That last piece requires some explanation, because Bennett Craft Builders itself didn't disappear when my father did. Once the criminal case concluded, Chris made the decision, with Deborah's help structuring the transaction, to formally buy out our father's remaining ownership stake and continue running the company independently. A decision I supported, even though my own relationship to that business will probably always carry some complicated weight, because Chris genuinely had nothing to do with any of what happened, and had, in his own way, been just as isolated from the full truth as I had. The buyout agreement included a specific provision, at Chris's insistence, establishing an ongoing revenue-based payment schedule toward my restitution, structured so the company's obligation to me would survive, even if my father, individually, never had sufficient assets to satisfy the judgment on his own. I want to note something about that provision, because it's the detail in this entire story that surprised me most. Chris didn't have to include it. The restitution order against our father didn't legally require the company itself to backstop the payments once he no longer owned it. He did it anyway, he told me, because once he'd sat through his own deposition and finally seen the up-close details of everything that had happened, complete picture of what our father had built and who it had cost, he didn't want any part of the business we'd both grown up around to keep functioning as though none of it had happened. It's not the kind of gesture that undoes 22 years, but it's the kind of gesture that made rebuilding an actual relationship with my brother, as opposed to just coexisting inside two separately isolated versions of the same family, feel possible for the first time in our adult lives. Between the property sale, the equipment liquidation, the TWC back pay order, and the structured payments, I recovered $351,000 of the $376,220, just over 93% within the first 2 years. The remaining balance continues under a garnishment order tied to my father's probation terms. You were promised a twist about what the money was actually used for, and I've given you pieces of it. The Caterpillar equipment used almost entirely for his own lake house, the HELOC drawn against an inheritance my grandmother specifically tried to protect for me. But there's one more piece, and it's the one I've had the hardest time sitting with. During the civil discovery process, Marcus traced roughly $41,000 of the misused funds to a source I hadn't expected: tuition and living expense payments for a program Chris's oldest daughter, my niece Emma, attended. A competitive out-of-state gymnastics academy that my father had proudly told the entire extended family at every holiday for 3 years he was personally funding as a grandfather's gift. A story he told, more than once, specifically in front of me, as an example of the kind of generosity he said I'd never quite learned to appreciate about him. He had used stolen money misclassified out of my own paychecks, money drawn against an inheritance meant to protect me specifically, to fund a public performance of generosity toward the golden child's daughter, in a family system where I was already cast as the person too ungrateful to notice how much he gave. It wasn't just theft. It was theft engineered in part to reinforce the exact role I'd spent 31 years trying to escape. I don't say that to suggest my niece did anything wrong, or that the gymnastics program itself was some kind of villainy. Emma is 12. She loves the sports, and none of this is remotely her fault. I say it because I think it's the clearest illustration in this entire case of how financial exploitation and family scapegoating aren't two separate things happening alongside each other. In a system like the one my father built, they're the same mechanism running in both directions at once, stealing from one child while performing generosity toward another, using both acts to reinforce the same story about who in the family was selfish and who was selfless. Chris took that particular discovery harder than almost anything else in the case, once Marcus walked him through it. He told me he'd spent 3 years thanking our father, genuinely, at every holiday, for a generosity he now understood had been funded in part by wages I should have been paid and an inheritance meant to protect me specifically. He was the one saying thank you. He told me, sitting in his truck outside Deborah's office after that meeting, while you were the one actually paying for it. He's since told Emma in age-appropriate terms that her grandfather did something wrong with money. Not the full story, not yet, but enough that she understands the gymnastics program came at a cost someone else in the family carried. And enough, Chris hopes, that she grows up understanding money and family loyalty aren't supposed to be tangled together the way ours were for so long. As for me, I now work as a controller for a mid-sized architecture firm in Dallas at a salary nearly double what Bennett Craft Builders ever paid me, with an employer who has never once suggested a budget variance was a reflection of my character. Chris and I speak most weeks now, something that would have been unthinkable during the years we were each isolated in our own version of the family story. My relationship with my mother is still, honestly, a work in progress. Grief for a parent who chose a role over you doesn't resolve the way estrangement from a stranger does. And my relationship with my father is, at this point, limited to what the court requires: garnishment records, probation compliance, and nothing more. I called Danny and Carla both, separately, the week the sentencing concluded, mostly to thank them for the small, honest observations that had ended up mattering more than either of them realized at the time. Carla cried again, briefly, then laughed at herself for crying twice over the same news. Danny, more practically minded, asked whether Bennett Craft Builders under Chris's ownership would still be bidding on the kind of projects he liked working. I told him I thought it would, and that I thought it would be a better place to work than it had been in years, precisely because the person running it now had finally seen the whole picture and chosen, deliberately, not to rebuild any part of the old one. I think often about the word I used in the title of this story, resigned, because I chose it carefully, and I want to explain why. I didn't resign from my family. I still have a relationship, however complicated, with my mother and my brother, and I don't think severing every tie was ever the healthiest or most honest outcome available to me. What I resigned from was the role, the scapegoat position itself, the unpaid, unacknowledged job of absorbing blame that was never mine, dressed up as loyalty, as family duty, as the price of belonging. That's the job I quit. Formally, on a Sunday night in April of 2021, typing a 2-paragraph email I almost didn't have the nerve to send. It turned out that resignation letter was worth $376,220, but honestly, even without the money, I think I would have written it anyway, eventually, once I finally had the words for what I'd actually been doing all those years. I want to close with something practical because I think the most useful thing I can do with a story this specific to family dynamics is turn it into something that might help someone else recognize their own situation sooner than I recognized mine. Here are the warning signs I missed, the ones I now tell people to watch for, especially if you recognize any version of the scapegoat in your own family role. 1. Consistent, disproportionate blame for financial or operational problems is itself a red flag, regardless of whether you can immediately disprove it. If you find yourself constantly auditing your own competence rather than the actual books, ask a neutral third party, an outside accountant, a lawyer, a financial planner, to look at the specific claim. Don't just look harder at yourself. 2. Watch for family financial structures where no two people have the complete picture. If you're a guarantor, a cosigner, or an authorized user on any account, confirm directly, in writing, with every other named party that they have the same documents you do. My father's entire scheme depended on Chris and I never comparing notes for 9 years. 3. Be suspicious of any routine paperwork that includes broad authorization language you're asked to sign quickly, especially from someone who has structural power over you, an employer, a parent, a spouse. Read every page every time, even at 11 at night, even during a crisis.
The clause that enabled most of what happened to me was on page 6 of an HR form I was told was routine. 4. Pull your full credit reports from all 3 bureaus at least twice a year, regardless of how much you trust the people with access to your identity. My unauthorized accounts sat undetected for up to 5 years. A routine 6-month check would have caught the first one far sooner. 5, and this is the one I want to leave you with the longest. If a family member seems unusually convinced of a negative story about you, that you're bad with money, or difficult, or the reason things go wrong, and that story never quite lines up with your own observable competence, consider that the story might be serving a purpose for them rather than describing you accurately. Roles inside dysfunctional family systems are rarely accidents. Someone usually benefits from them staying fixed. 6. If you work inside a family business, insist on seeing your complete compensation history, broken out by category, at least once a year, regardless of how that request is received. My father was able to underpay me for a decade, partly because I never had a full, itemized picture of what I was actually being paid versus what I believed I was being paid. A request for that documentation is not disloyalty. It's basic financial literacy applied to your own life. 7. Pay attention to any authorization language buried inside paperwork you're told is routine, especially from someone who holds structural power over you. HR forms, benefits enrollment packets, and account updates are exactly the kind of documents people skim quickly because they seem procedural. That's precisely why they're where broad authorization clauses tend to get buried. Read every page every time, even when you're exhausted, even when the person handing it to you is someone you'd never expect to exploit that exhaustion. I also want to leave you with a short, practical version of what actually rebuilding a life like this required, in case you recognize your own situation right now and don't know where to begin. First, stop trying to resolve it inside the family system and start documenting outside of it. Pull your credit reports, request your compensation records, gather anything you can access quietly before anyone involved has reason to alter or conceal it further. Second, find an attorney experienced in either financial exploitation or family business disputes specifically, since the legal strategy for a case tangled up in family dynamics differs meaningfully from a straightforward stranger fraud case. Third, if wage or tax issues are involved, don't overlook state labor agencies like the Texas Workforce Commission. They have investigative authority that can move independently of and sometimes faster than a criminal referral. Fourth, expect the people around the person who hurt you to need time, sometimes uncomfortable amounts of it, to update their own understanding of the family story. My mother's shift took the better part of a year, and I had to grieve, separately, the version of her that I'd wished would believe me instantly. And fifth, be patient with the financial recovery itself. Mine took roughly 2 years from resignation to the bulk of restitution actually arriving. Done thoroughly enough to hold up under scrutiny, it works, but it is almost never fast. If you grew up with a role like mine, scapegoat, golden child, the invisible one, the family hero who held everything together, and you've ever wondered whether that role was quietly costing you something financial as well as emotional, I want to hear about it in the comments. What was your role, and when did you first start to question the story your family told about you? If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real financial fraud investigations and share this with anyone who's ever been told by someone with power over them that they're the reason things keep going wrong. Sometimes that story needs a second look, and sometimes, underneath it, there's a very specific dollar amount waiting to be found. One more thing before I go, because I think it's the honest ending rather than the tidy one. I keep a copy of that TWC hearing transcript in a drawer in my home office, the one with the $376,220 figure read into an official record. I don't take it out often,
But I know it's there, in the same way I now know, in a way I didn't for 31 years, that a role assigned to a child at a family dinner table is not a verdict on that child's character. It's just a role, one that can be resigned from, documented, and eventually, if you're both determined and lucky enough to find the right people to help you, corrected on the record by someone with the authority to say so. I spent 31 years being told I was the reason things went wrong. It took one resignation email, a forensic accountant, a document examiner, and a Collin County judge to finally hear, out loud in a room that had nothing to do with Thanksgiving dinner or QuickBooks logins, I never was. I'll see you in the next one.